Abdullah ibn Umar narrates a story told by the Prophet ﷺ, a story that we definitely need to reflect on, draw lessons that are quite relevant to our lives as much as we can. A story in which the Prophet ﷺ speaks of three men who set out on a journey. While they were on their journey, the clouds have gathered and started to pour heavy rain on them. So heavy was the rain that they needed a shelter, and they indeed stumbled upon a cave in a mountain and entered into the cave to protect themselves from the rain. And while they were inside of the cave, and while the rain was pouring, a huge boulder fell from the mountain and landed at the entrance of the cave, blocking it completely, trapping the three men in the cave. Suddenly, light turns into darkness. All they see is their own demise and death. For they had no exit out of that cave, dear brothers and sisters. They're trapped. I want you to think for a moment about their condition, the darkness, the crisis they're in. All doors around them are locked. There is no exit, there is no relief. Imminent death is what they were facing starvation and thirst. What will they do? I ask you, dear brothers and sisters, as we tell this story about what you will do to get help. Where will you turn? And how will you turn to that entity that you're going to turn to? What is it that you're going to use as a means of relieving yourself in this darkest of moments? And how often do we run into moments in our lives when we're stuck in a corner, when we're stumbling in darkness, when we're in a quandary, in a crisis that we have no relief or exit out of? What do you do, brothers and sisters? Allah teaches the most powerful of lessons, and here is what these three men do. They had no physical or materialistic means to help them. All means are exhausted. They turn to Allah. And indeed, Allah puts us in difficult moments and tests in life, dear brothers and sisters, where all the doors are shut and Allah is present with you. And you turn to Him. One of the men instantly recognized what they needed. And it's a lesson for all of us. He looked at the other two men, his friends. He said to them, let us look at our deeds, and in particular, the most sincere of the deeds. Not any deed. And let us ask Allah Azza wa Jal and invoke Him with the most sincere deeds. The deeds that were delivered only to Allah Azza wa Jal, seeking the pleasure of Allah. Each of them knew right away, dear brothers and sisters, what deeds this man was talking about. So they all agreed, let us ask Allah individually by the deeds that are most sincere. So the first man proceeds and turns to Allah sincerely, saying, "O Allah, you know that I had parents that I cared for and I tended to. And each day I would go out and tend to my flock. I come back home at the end of the day and I milk my sheep. And I take the milk, and before my own children and wife can drink from the milk, I give the milk to my parents, out of love and affection for them and to please you. And oh Allah, you know that that day, He remembered the deed, dear brothers and sisters. Because a deed so sincere that you do only for Allah stands out. You know it, Allah knows it. Nobody else does. He knew the effect of the deed. He says, oh Allah, you know, on that day I came back late and I milked my sheep and I went home and I had the milk, but my parents were asleep. And my children came to me wanting the milk. But my heart felt that it was inappropriate for me to give the milk to my children before my parents. So they weep at my feet, my children begging me for the milk. And my heart could not accept that my parents would drink the milk after the rest of my family. But they were asleep and I didn't want to wake them up. So I went by them and I stood by them, looking at them as they were asleep, not wishing to disturb them while my kids were waiting for the milk. And oh Allah, you know that I stayed with my parents the rest of the night until they woke up and gave them the milk before any of my children could drink. Oh Allah, do you know if this deed was sincere, that it was only done for your sake, then relieve us in our affliction. As soon as he made the dua, dear brothers and sisters, for Allah knows whether that deed was sincere or not. Instantly, all three of them witnessed with their own eyes the boulder moving a little bit, allowing some light to enter into the cave. They could see light. But it wasn't that much of a movement that it would allow them to exit the cave. They see evidence of Allah, dear brothers and sisters, and evidence of what happens when you do something for the sake of Allah. The second man proceeds to ask Allah Azza wa Jal, saying, oh Allah, you know that I had an attractive cousin that I was in love with. And one day I was by myself with her and I wanted to satisfy my desires with her. And I reached out to her. She agreed only if I gave her money. 100 dinars. So I gave her the money. And when I was in control of her and I was on top of her, she said to me, servant of Allah, fear Allah Azza wa Jalla. And don't break the seal, meaning the seal of chastity, except by the lawful means. My heart was overwhelmed by her statement. And I retreated right away. I moved away from her and I left her. Out of fear of Allah Azza wa Jalla. Oh Allah, if you know that I did this deed, seeking only your pleasure, make an exit for us out of this problem. And instantly, dear brothers and sisters, the boulder starts moving some more in front of their eyes. The third man proceeds to invoke Allah Azza wa Jalla, saying, Oh Allah, you know that one day I hired a workman, and near the completion of his work, the agreement was to pay his wages in the form of a measure of rice. So I gave him what was due to him, the measure of rice. But apparently the man didn't think it was enough. So he left without taking anything, left in dissatisfaction. So I didn't know what to do. I took that measure of rice and I invested it. I used it as seeds and I grew crops. And I used the return from the crops to buy some flock and cows and sheep. And suddenly I became wealthy. Out of those seeds that were initially intended for the man, from his wages. It grew and grew and I had much possession from these seeds. Later in my life, the man comes back. Remembers that he had money owed to him by this man. And he said, fear Allah Azza wa Jal and give me my wages that you owe me. Years later, he comes back. He says to Allah, oh Allah, you know that I looked at him and I said to him, you see all this flock and all these cows and sheep? They're yours, take them. So the man thought that he was making fun of him. So he said to him, don't make fun of me. Give me my wages. He said, I'm not making fun of you. All of what you see came from your wages and it's yours. Take it. When the man realized that he was serious, he took all of it and left. Took all of his possessions. The third man turns to Allah and says, Oh Allah, if you know that I did this deed, seeking only your pleasure, Oh Allah, relieve us and save us. Instantly, dear brothers and sisters, the three men witnessed the boulder moving completely out of the entrance. And they emerge out of the cave and proceed on their journey. In the midst of their darkness, in the darkness of that cave, in this unresolvable crisis, a problem that could not be solved by traditional or materialistic means. What is it that saved them? It was the power of the purity of intention behind one deed for the sake of Allah Azza wa Jalla. And Allah relieved them instantly. Amazing things await us in life. Extraordinary blessings, relief, solutions, healing await us, dear brothers and sisters. Only if we intended well behind our actions. Only if that heart was looking towards Allah and not expecting a reward or compensation from a human being. Allah will do wonders with us. How many of us, dear brothers and sisters, are sitting in our caves, confused, uncertain, bewildered by life, unsure as to how to proceed, looking for healing and solutions and relief from human beings around us, not sure how to deal or cope with any problem that we have, not understanding, just as these three men knew, if I had that one deed that I could beg Allah with. So I ask you, dear brothers and sisters, if you're in that cave, the cave of life, not necessarily a cave in a mountain, do you have that deed that you know and Allah knows? It's not about appearances. You know you have that, at least one deed that you can beg Allah with. And Allah will answer you like He answered these three men. Only you know the answer. And how many of our actions do not have that sincere intention and are driven by motives other than Allah? And you know what they're doing to us? They're going like weight. And we're not understanding that these are the deeds we desperately need, for all of our hope can be hung on them. They are your saviors, dear brothers and sisters. Power like no other you can attain from merely looking towards Allah in your heart. Extraordinary outcomes in life. We ask Allah Azza wa Jalla to bless us with sincerity of intentions. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله العظيم لي ولكم فاستغفروه.